So today's presenter is John Shalas. Sorry, John, I'm sure I butchered your name there. I apologize for that. But John is with the Research Forester with the Integrating Human and Natural System Work Unit of the Southern Research Station of the USDA Forest Service in Athens, Georgia. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to John.
Okay, hopefully you can hear me now. So this is John Shalas, and I'd like to start by acknowledging the co-authors on this presentation, Sarah Hitchner, Cassandra Johnson, Dr. Rory Fraser, and Amadou Diop. I'm going to go on. So what I wanted to talk to you a little bit about came out of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Project. This is a project that was designed and funded by the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities in partnership with the Natural Resource Conservation Service and the U.S. Forest Service. This idea was really planned to be a 6-year program beginning in 2012 with 2-year pilot projects in 3 states, Alabama, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And the idea is to build and coordinate systems of support for African American landowners and to test the potential of sustainable forestry practices to help stabilize African American land ownership, to increase forest health, and to build economic assets in the Southern Black Belt. So the goals of the pilot program are basically, these are the 3 pilot projects that I just talked about, is to move a certain number of African American forest owners to a position of secure ownership and high probability for profitable long-term forest management, to model some new effective and flexible systems of support for African American forest landowners, and also to learn more and to document more some things about African American forest owners, such as their attitudes towards the use and management of their forests, the conditions of their forests, and the potential for sustainable forest management to increase profitability and land asset value. These projects, so there are 3 projects, as I mentioned. The locations of the 3 pilot projects, one is in rural northeastern North Carolina, which is being carried out through the Roanoke Rural Electric Cooperative. Basically, the U.S. Endowment put out a call for proposals, and various community-based organizations submitted proposals, and these 3 were selected. The second one is in 5 coastal counties of South Carolina, which is being carried out through the Center for Heirs Property Preservation. And then there are 2 projects in Alabama, in west central Alabama, one being carried out through L.R. Lean, the Limited Resource Landowner Education and Assistance Network, and one being carried out through the Federation of Southern Cooperatives. So what we did was we agreed to do some baseline research and in association with these projects, and the baseline research, sort of the goals for the baseline research that were laid out by the U.S. Endowment for Forestry and Communities were, 1, to establish some baseline conditions, sort of know where people were at in terms of forestry, to understand some of the issues, and then to later be able to measure progress, and then to provide some additional information for the pilot project so they could strengthen their planning and management, and to provide some data that would help guide the future of the program, and then also to make a contribution to the scholarship on African Americans, forests, and their land. Let me just sort of, by way of introduction, talk a little bit about what we know about forest owners in general. There has been a lot of previous research on what are sometimes called non-industrial private forest landowners, sometimes family forest landowners. From that research, we know that there is really a diversity of different kinds of land ownerships in terms of tract size, the ownership status, the forest conditions, and the history. We also know that there's a lot of diversity among forest landowners. They do tend to be older. The income can vary. We haven't had as much research sort of delving into the issues related to race, ethnicity, and gender as we would like to have, and hopefully what we've done can make a contribution towards that. We also know that they have diverse reasons for owning their forest land. Very few forest landowners list timber as their primary objective, although many do sell trees and timber at some point. They own it for aesthetic reasons, for family heritage reasons, for all kinds of other reasons like that, for wildlife conservation, things like that. And we also know that there are very different levels of engagement with forestry. Even looking at the larger group of family forest landowners, relatively few have written forest management plans, and people have a really wide variety of actually engagement with forestry activities. There hasn't been nearly as much research focusing on African American forest owners, but there has been some. And from that we know that that they show some similar levels of diversity to the larger pool of family forest landowners, but there are a couple of critical differences that they have. They tend to have less land, that is, they have smaller land holdings. They tend to have made less use of financial and technical assistance, and tend to have used fewer forest management techniques. And we also know that they're more likely to have heirs property, and by heirs property we mean property that has been passed on for several generations without sort of proper legal inheritance procedures, so it's often held in common by a large group of family members who are the heirs of the original owner. And so these factors are all have some relation to patterns of historical discrimination and basically the structural patterns that revolve around race and land. But we do know that African American forest owners highly value their land, and they highly value intergenerational transfer of land. And we believe that they have less of a focus on forests and more of a focus on their land and on agriculture. So when we sort of began to talk with the U.S. Endowment and the Forest Service, and the U.S. Endowment sat down together to try to develop procedures for baseline research, we began to talk about what we could do. The first thing we did was look at the National Woodlands Owners Survey, which is sort of the equivalent of the Ag Census, but for forest landowners. So we have results from all states, but we have relatively, but those, the sampling of the National Woodlands Owners Survey is designed to produce results at the state level. So when we get down to the smaller areas that the pilot projects are operating in, we really couldn't get the data that we needed from the National Woodlands Owners Survey. You know, we talked about doing a mail or telephone survey too, but we know that response to mail and phone surveys has declined recently. We all are submitted to lots of opportunities to complete surveys, and people are tending to say no more frequently. And we also have a suspicion that African Americans' response to surveys tend to be lower. And then we weren't really sure we could get the information that we needed through a survey that would actually help in the project's planning and design. What we really thought we needed was to use some research techniques that would really help us get some really nuanced information on some of the complexity of forest ownerships, the pattern within families, the legal status, how people made decisions about their forest land, their values, the practices, their use of assistance, some of their social relationships, who they talked to about forest management, who they got information from, and collected some of the stories about their forest history and about their present conditions. So what we came up with was using procedures that we drew from rapid appraisal techniques, which are an established technique in international development that are used as a basis for project planning and developing future research projects. The thing with rapid appraisals is that they provide a really good overview. They provide some good overview in a relatively short period of time of field work, but they don't necessarily have the, they face some sampling issues and some data depth issues. So I want to acknowledge that our research has the limitations that are associated with rapid appraisals. So our specific research objectives for the rapid appraisal for the baseline research was to learn something about the diversity of landowners that were out there, to collect baseline conditions for a set of landowners, to provide detailed information about landowner outlooks, practices, resource limitations, and opportunities, and then hopefully this information can serve as a focal point for some discussions about the development and improvement of the program. The research team, in every case when we went out into the field, the research team was introduced by either a project representative from the projects that were managing the pilot projects that I showed you earlier. I think there was no one person that was at every single interview, but members of the team, particularly the first 5 people on this list, there were generally several of them at each interview. So the research project, we did the research just this year, July, August, and September. July in South Carolina, August in North Carolina, and September in Alabama. And the way that we carried out the research was to work with the pilot projects to select a diverse sample of landowners, trying to really get a good representation in terms of age, gender, involvement in forestry, amount of land, sort of all these different things. Just so we were trying to capture the diversity that was out there. The team spent 3 weeks in each site. The plan was, and we actually did accomplish this, was to interview 20 forest owners per site, half of whom were core program participants, sometimes called Tier 1 participants, and half who were not intimately involved with the pilot project. In addition to the social research, in every case, a forester went out to assess the forest conditions that each landowner had. This sort of reflects the interdisciplinary nature of the rapid appraisal project, trying to bring together some of the social, economic, and biophysical aspects together. The actual interview involved a 2 to 3 hour site visit, an interview, some discussion, and when possible, we walked the land with the landowner. We were concerned that we do something to make it worthwhile for the landowner. And what we ultimately decided was we would give them a written summary of their response to the interview, and then we would give them a copy of the rapid assessment of their forest land by the forester, and that we would try to send those as quickly as possible after we finished the research, and that these could be used by the landowners for their own planning, sharing, or just for a historical record about what they were thinking at a particular period of time when the interview was carried out. And each interview also, was able to be in contact with the program, since they were contacted by each of the pilot projects, so they had that opportunity to become involved in future program activities. So I want to go over a little bit of the results. We asked each interviewee that they could have as many family members from as many generations as possible present for the interview, and so many of the interviews were of groups of family members. Just to sort of sum up the demographics and sort of in a qualitative sense, since we didn't really have a random sample. So most of the owners were older, 50 plus, many much older than that. which is actually typical for forest landowners in general. We found that nearly all had bachelor's or advanced degree, so they were a highly educated group, which is interesting and somewhat surprising, but not that different from some questionnaire research that we did in Macon County, Alabama several years ago, where we also found a very high level of education among African American forest landowners who responded to the survey. We found that professional employment was common, particularly in the education field. Many teachers, principals, and other people who are involved in education or in other kinds of professional employment were the respondents. The income varied. Some people were fairly wealthy. Many were older and on fixed incomes through retirement. We had a good gender diversity. Probably more than half of the interviewees were female. One of the first things we started off with when we did the interviews was we asked them something about the history and the meaning of the land. We found that the interviewees had long historical ties to the land, often going back several generations, and that many of them had either continuously lived on the land since childhood, had grown up on the land and moved off someplace else, and someplace come back. In other places, just maintained that connection through frequent visits. We heard many stories about the struggle that it was for African American families to obtain and to retain their land over time. You know, in some cases, the land had been in families back to the 1800s. We also heard stories of land loss about other family members or neighbors who had lost their land, often through some combination of sort of falling into economic hardship and maybe someone trying to sort of to recognize their economic hardship and instead of helping them, trying to take away their land from them. And there were some people that had been buying land more recently, although probably the majority of them had land that had been in the family for a long time. When we asked people about their early memories of the land, most of those memories related to farming, post-subsistence, and cash cropping. People talked about being out there working in the fields, planting and harvesting crops, tobacco, corn, collards, all that kind of thing. So we really want to emphasize that the land was important to the families. The land was seen as having this important tie to the family heritage and history. It represented the hard work and struggle that ancestors had gone through to obtain and to retain the land, and many people felt a responsibility to keep that in the family. And I think you could say that the land was tied up with many people's family identities. The land is also, to some extent, an economic asset, but probably about 50% of the people said that it actually cost them money to have the land. In other words, they weren't making enough from the land to be able to pay the expenses, such as taxes and other kinds of things. The land also played a role in reducing risk. People mentioned that if you had some land, you would always have a place to live. That land could be used for collateral. So land was seen as being important to have, even if you weren't making money from the land. The cultural value of land ownership was very high, and I think that probably reflects both people being excluded from land ownership for a long time and the efforts that people had made to become landowners. So ownership itself had a very high value. Many people had family reunions on the land to bring families back together, so the land was sort of the site of family get-togethers. And in some cases, I think particularly in South Carolina, many of the people we interviewed were actually residing in what effectively had been over the long term minority communities or ethnic enclaves, some of which were beginning to break down due to land loss and purchases of land from people outside the community. I want to talk a little bit about heirs property. When we asked people about heirs property, many people didn't respond with the legal definition, that is land that has been sort of legally passed on without a will, but rather they viewed heirs property simply as land that has been passed on from one generation to the other. Nonetheless, the people that had the legal heir property situation told stories of the complexity of trying to resolve these, where the land may have been passed on for several generations. People had moved to all different parts of the country, and you basically have to begin with a family genealogy and figure out who the various peoples are that have some rights to the land, and trace that out and try to contact those people and then get them to agree on some kind of solution. So it is a very complex situation. We asked people how the taxes got paid on the land. In some cases, people did shared payments for heir property. In some cases, the taxes were paid by the person that was the economic beneficiary of the land at the current time, like someone who might be farming the land. Although, if the taxes were being paid by one person, then, that could result in that person feeling like they had, say, more rights to the land than their legal share actually was. The ways people were dealing with heir property were very varied. Some people had just divided it and they were going their own way. Some people had informally divided the land, so each person sort of knew what part of the land belonged to them, even though it was still legally considered one parcel. In some cases, people even had subdivided into separate tax parcels, even though the land was all owned in common, which seems kind of problematic because they may feel like it's sort of legally taken care of, although it's not. In some cases, the land had been divided, and people were trying to sort of retain their individual ownership, but bring it back together under common management. In some cases, land had been passed on to one or more heirs that were selected from the family members as the ones most likely to be able to keep the land and maintain it and to manage it over time. And some of these people were buying out other heirs. And we did have a few examples of people who, were really doing what you might think of as the gold standard, putting it into some sort of joint ownership, a trust, or a limited liability corporation. We talked with them some about what they would like to have happen to their land in future generations. We found that often there was one or several members that were trying particularly hard to maintain the land for future generations, both for heritage and economic reasons. People talked about how each generation must carry the torch and make sure that the land gets passed on to the next generation. And many people mentioned how their land was kind of either through heirs property situations or through not being managed for farming or for forestry, was not really managed as well as they would like it to be, but they were trying to get it sorted out for the next generation. So people were taking on that responsibility. There was some concern about upcoming generations having fewer ties to the land. I think we had the sense that the people that we talked to were maybe the last generation that had actually grown up working on the land. And there are a variety of forces that are pulling people away from the land, age and life cycle. People get jobs far away from the land, can only find jobs in the city, and so over time becoming less and less familiar. And attached to the land, but nevertheless, almost everybody we interviewed said that they had this constant mantra for future generations to never sell the land. They really wanted to have this land which had been passed on to them by a previous generation to be passed on to the next generation and taken care of. So the land was in a variety of conditions. There was some farm and pasture land. There was a lot of naturally regrown forests. There were old houses, cemeteries, memory places, things like that. When the foresters did a rapid assessment in each site to describe the forest conditions and make some preliminary management recommendations. So many of the lands had a lot of low-value, naturally regenerated mixed stands. Also, many of them needed thinning or fire, but there were some people that had fairly high-quality stands that were ready to harvest and to replant, and many of those people were moving forward with that process. I would mention that in a separate project, the Conservation Fund is doing growth and yield models for 60 properties projected out for 35 years just to see what would happen if these lands are managed for forestry into the future. We asked people about their desired uses of the land. Many were interested in forestry. That tended to be new and tended to be a result of the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program. The land was also seen as an important family gathering place. People talked about wanting to build some sort of an educational or recreational center for the community on their land. Commonly, people hunted either themselves, their friends and families. Some people leased out their hunting lands, and many people were interested in wildlife preservation. In terms of experience with forestry activities, plans, and programs, we found that many people had sold timber, often either because they had a financial need and it saw someone out, or because a buyer had come by and offered to buy timber. Many felt they maybe had been underpaid and they didn't have a lot of context with other people that were doing forestry to be able to know what a fair price would be. We did find that very few had actually planted trees. Most timber stands had been naturally regenerated. Very few had done prescribed burning, and only a few had been involved with the various government assistance programs, such as CRP, the Conservation Reserve Program. But people did talk about how they had observed and admired managed forests for a long period of time, and were very happy to be having the opportunity to get involved with that. And they recognized that they would be in a much better situation if their families had gotten involved in forestry in a more formal way earlier on, and really felt that that they were behind other landowners, hadn't really had access to forestry or this kind of information. There were some trust issues. People had, I think because of the legacy of discrimination, people have a distrust of government, of foresters and loggers, and a reluctance to sign papers with those kinds of people for fear that it will be used to take away their land. We asked people specifically about the constraints that we face, and I think I could really say that there was no one overall constraint. Some people wanted more information, or more appropriate information, more timely information. Some people lacked the labor or technical skill. Finances was an issue for some people. In some cases, the family had yet to come to an agreement, and some people didn't have enough time. So really a variety of different constraints. We were interested in where people got information, and I would mention that there are some separate projects in North Carolina and South Carolina, one by the University of Georgia, Puneet Betty, and one by, I think it's the Aldo Leopold Institute, maybe, in South Carolina, that are looking at social networks. But we did find that there was a very heavy reliance on program personnel for information advice, for things like contractor recommendations, and even reminders to meet some of the deadlines, like they might have to meet if they were participating in a government assistance program. There were some people that had historically had contacts in industry, government, or extension, but in many cases people said, well, I had this really good contact, but that person, that person retired, or that person wasn't there anymore. So we really saw that the information networks that people had tended to be very fragile. If the one person that they knew left, they didn't necessarily have someone else that they could go to and talk to. Although there were some exceptions, there were some people that routinely talked with others about forestry, and these tended to be the people that were most involved in forestry prior to the program. We did find, as we interviewed people, they often talked about people they had met through the Sustainable Forestry and African American Land Retention Program, which I think indicates that the program is helping to connect people with other people with similar interests and in similar situations. We asked them some about what they knew about some more, I guess you might say, more technical forestry issues like watershed protection, bioenergy, because there were some bioenergy plants in close to some of the sites, and certifications such as SFI or FSC or tree farm. And we found that there was generally very little awareness of those, except for some people who had encountered these through their professional work or public service work, and many people had recently heard about them through the program, but there was lots of interest in beginning to learn more about these kinds of issues. We asked them about their other goals and objectives, including buying and selling land. Most people were just trying to get a handle on the land that they had. Some people were trying to acquire land. Many people mentioned the Lord isn't making any more land, so we want to get some, or we want to keep what we have. There was buying and selling from family members to keep land in the family. And in general, though people mentioned they may have some land that they might sell in the future, it was almost always not their family land. They wanted to keep that land. In terms of the role of the Sustainable Forestry Program, we really found that this was really the primary source of information that people had. People mentioned this, these names here are the list of the program foresters that we worked with. People said, well, I don't really have any problem with information. I just call Sam, Alton, Hodges, Andrew, or Alex. So right now people are very dependent on the program, but I think that's okay, because it takes, we're talking about a very significant resource that people have. People have not had a lot of experience with forestry, and people need a little help getting started in the process, and I think that help is probably required for a few years. We did see that the program was doing a good job of building connections among landowners, and also between landowners and forestry professionals, and also that because the program is working at a variety of levels with extension agents and state-level agencies and things like that, the program seems to be playing a really big role in focusing attention on the situation of minority landowners and the efforts to involve them more in government assistance programs and forestry. That is pretty much what we have here. I just want to sort of talk about this as an example where we really tried to link the research with with practice with the people that were out there trying to the various pilot projects that were trying to get people more involved in forestry and bring together issues such as values and decision-making, history, social structure, forestry experience, social networks, and community-based approaches. We're still working on analyzing the data. We expect to have reports and papers coming out in the near future. I would like to thank all the people from the pilot projects who helped us and facilitated the research. I think with that, we can move on and take some questions.
Thank you, John. So at this time, folks, as you get questions, please type them into the chat window, and we'll moderate these questions back so that John can answer them for all of us to hear. So here's your first question, John. In reference to desired uses, did any people speak about growing plants in the forest understory, i.e. things like useful for crafts or medicinal plants, forest farming?
We actually asked people specifically, try to talk to them a little bit about agroforestry, and I think these were landowners that were relatively new to forestry, and we found that they, for the most part, they didn't have a lot of awareness of a variety of these different agroforestry approaches, similar to they didn't have a lot of awareness to things like certification and to watershed protection and things like that. But we did encounter several landowners that were interested in doing that. So I think it's primarily an issue that they just have not really heard about that or been presented with the opportunities to learn more about it.
Okay. Next question was there any indication if African American landowners were targeted more by buyers to sell their timber than other landowners?
Yeah, I don't really know that we could answer that because we really did focus our research on African Americans. We didn't, it wasn't a comparative study with other kinds of landowners. So I don't really know. I mean, oftentimes when a logger or a timber buyer is working in a particular area, they'll try and be in touch with other people in that area, so they don't have to move their equipment around. And I think that can be a good opportunity for the landowners as long as they get a fair price. But I really can't say anything about African Americans being targeted in more or in any kind of different way than other landowners. We just actually don't know that. That was not part of our study.
All right. Next question is, would more African American consulting foresters likely lead to better management of African American owned forest land? If so, how can more African Americans be recruited into consulting forestry?
Well, I think that's an interesting question, and that is something that we've had a discussion about when we've been out in the pilot projects. I think to some extent, I think having someone from the community who's African American, who understands the issues, who looks and thinks and talks like the landowners, can be helpful. But I think sometimes, the African American landowners and foresters made it clear that the foresters didn't have to be African American, that it was possible for consulting foresters from any ethnic group or any racial group to work effectively with African Americans. So so I think it would help some, but I don't think that that's the only thing that's going to work. In terms of how to recruit more African Americans, I think it takes continuing efforts by the forestry school. There are certainly efforts at the 1890s. At the 1890 land grants, historically black land grants, a forestry program at Alabama A&M University, a pre-forestry program at Tuskegee University, and many of the other 1890 schools have other ways of getting people involved in forestry or agroforestry. I think that's a good step, but I think it's also important for for the other land grants to effectively recruit more minorities into their forestry programs, and for other consultants to welcome African American consultants into the business. I'm not hearing anything.
Sorry, I turned on that button.
I thought you were muted.
I'm repeating myself here. Okay, so the question is, was there any kind of follow-up surveys done with the younger generation?
That's a good question. In some cases, people brought members of the younger generation to the interviews. It's not clear necessarily that they could speak completely freely because their parents and their elders were there, but we did endeavor to talk to them, and that's pretty much the extent that we have engagement that we have done. I think I would add that I think one of our hopes was by doing the rapid appraisal and getting some preliminary information that we could maybe build a larger collaborative project with both 1890 and other land grant institutions in the variety of states where we might be able to, maybe look to AFRI or Foundation or some other kind of some other kind of funding source where we could take this information and get some ideas on how to do more detailed data collection in the future. And so I would just say now that I would welcome anybody that wants to collaborate on something like that in the future.
Okay. So from Chris, he's wondering if there's any stats on the average size in reference to acreage of participant holdings.
We have not calculated those yet, and I guess I would say because we did a diversity sample, not a random sample. I would rather describe the general holdings more qualitatively rather than put them in average sizes, because I think those average sizes can be misleading. I hope we probably will do that eventually with the appropriate caveats. We did, along with Puneet Dwivedi at the University of Georgia, just actually got all the African American data from the National Woodlands Owners Survey in the South. So I don't have that offhand, but we do have the statistics that come out of the National Woodlands Owners Survey. But I think anything that we calculated would not be representative enough to draw any conclusions from.
Okay. So were any of the landowners aware of financial assistance through various conservation programs, and were they interested in participating?
People were becoming aware through the pilot projects being run by the different groups. There were a handful of people who had been aware, who had either tried to apply for assistance before or who had actually obtained assistance before. That number was probably in the single digits across the 60 owners, the 60 interviewees. People were interested for sure. There was a lot of enthusiasm for getting involved in conservation and forestry programs, and enthusiasm for applying for the assistance, the assistance that's out there. And I would say that in the pilot sites, I think the various assistance programs that are there are trying hard to make themselves available to the landowners so that they don't get discouraged, and try to help them negotiate the bureaucracy, which can be an issue at times, as we all know.
Okay. For groups of landowners who had formed a trust or corporation, were their forests managed better?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there were probably 2 or 3 that did that. I'm just thinking of the examples. One was very engaged, very active in forestry. The person happened to come out of a forestry program at an 1890 university. One of the family members. Another one, which had gone through the process on their own to form a limited liability corporation, had not been involved in forestry very much in the past. So I don't necessarily think there's a strong link. People want to retain the land. I think there's a tendency among many African Americans to not have thought a lot about forestry in the past, and it was really the land that was the most important thing to them.
So for the next question, you mentioned how the landowners want to hold on to their land and everything and pass it on. Was there any discussion or interest expressed by landowners in reference to estate planning and taking the steps to make sure everything's in place to pass it on to the next generation, or was this lacking?
No, there was interest in that, and I would say that each of the pilot projects has both a forestry assistance program and an estate planning assistance program. So, for example, the Center for Heirs Property Preservation in South Carolina is ready to work with people, has people there to work with people once they express an interest in becoming involved in the estate planning process. So the pilot projects offer both forestry and estate planning assistance, and people were interested in taking advantage of that. I think that said, but in terms of both forestry and estate planning, it often times takes people a while to think about it, to consider their options, to talk amongst the family, to get everybody on the same page. So it's not something that people can necessarily jump right into. It's a process.
Okay. So are there any reports that were generated from this survey, less the privacy information, that gives some more numbers or stats about the survey?
They will be coming out very soon. We have sort of an internal South Carolina report that's and we do have some general summary information that was submitted to the U.S. Endowment that is available, that I think they're going to make available on their website. We have not completed the analysis. Like I said, we just finished up the we just finished up the field work the end of September. Did our last interview in October, actually. But we're focusing on this. We hope to get some reports and publications out. If you're interested in those, just send me an email, and I will make sure that you get something as soon as we have something that can be publicly released.
Okay. Is there a copy of the presentation available to the viewers?
I believe
I can answer this one, John. So it's on the Forestry webinar portal where you joined today's webinar. There's actually a handout there of today's presentation available in a PDF file format available for you to download and print. So yes, there is one available. So our next question is, to what extent do you think online forestry resources would be effective when trying to reach out to this group?
That's a good question. And I think, we did talk to a number of people who had been looking online for information, and I think it's helpful. I think in the case of people who have not previously been involved in forestry, there are often questions that it's very helpful to have someone in person to talk to, either a peer or a professional forester or an extension agent. But particularly in terms of finding providers to perform particular activities, just people want to know just how their trees are doing once they're out there in the ground. So I do think that people will use online information, but I also think that that maybe it's best when complemented by some in-person information.
Okay. So how did landowners who were generally well-educated explain their relatively limited knowledge of forestry?
Well, good question. Some people said, the information was out there and it was not made available to us. Some people said, well, maybe we should have been out there trying to find it more. I think there was a tendency to feel like people that they weren't invited to meetings, they weren't invited to participate in programs, they were excluded. Some people that I think we did feel that people had much more of an agricultural orientation because many people had come up through agriculture, their families had come up through agriculture, and in some cases there was a reluctance to plant trees in areas that had been cleared of trees for agriculture, even though things have changed over time, and that may be the better choice in terms of land use. So I think there's a variety of reasons why people haven't done it. But it's interesting that people are so educated and so professional and so involved in the community still have not become involved in forestry, and I think that it's a combination of factors, really.
All right. So at this time, if there's any more questions, we have a couple minutes left yet for today's webinar. Please feel to enter them into the chat window. And while we wait to see if there's a question or two, I'd like to send out the link for the satisfaction survey. And if you're looking to obtain continuing education credits, remember you'll need to complete this survey. There'll be a short quiz and then also a form that you'll need to fill out. I'm going to push out the link through the chat window. You can click on it there, but also be aware that I'm going to push it out through the Collaborate, which will open your browser so you can get to it that way also. And so that should open a browser. It may open up behind your Collaborate window, or it may open up in front, but you can take a minute or two to complete that at your time. If you copy that link and save it, you can actually come back later to complete that satisfaction survey. Okay, since it doesn't look like there's any more questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank John for his time and presenting today's webinar. Definitely a very interesting topic, and I've learned a lot. I hope you all have too. Thank you, John, for all that you've done and presenting today's webinar.
Yeah, thank you, Robert, for the opportunity, and everyone who participated. And if you have any questions, feel free to email or call me, and I can make sure you get the updated information as we come out with it.